Hello, everyone. Welcome to JBC English Learning Academy. Don't forget to subscribe for daily tips to improve your English. Have you ever had a normal, everyday day that suddenly became something you will never forget? Or have you noticed how small decisions can quietly change the direction of your life without you even realizing it? Sometimes we go through events that feel simple at first, but leave a lasting impression. And have you ever tried to explain a real-life experience in English, but found that your words sounded a little flat or unnatural? Maybe the story sounded okay in your mind, but when you spoke, it didn't come out the way you wanted. That happens to many people, especially when they're learning a new language. Today on the English Talk podcast, I am Blake, and together we're going to practice using real-life stories that are simple, natural, and honest. These are not perfect stories like you see in movies. They are not full of dramatic action or big twists. They are the kind of stories that people tell their friends, family, or coworkers when they want to share what really happened and how they felt. I will tell you short stories from real life using clear English. I will speak slowly enough so you can notice how ideas connect, how emotions are expressed, and how details are added without making the story complicated. Listen carefully and pay attention to how one sentence leads to the next. Notice how simple words can sound more advanced if you use them carefully. Let me start with a story about a small mistake that became an important lesson for me. A few months ago, I agreed to help a colleague with a project. The project was already behind schedule and they needed extra help. I didn't want to say no because I wanted to be helpful and show that I was a good team player. At first, I thought it would only take a little extra time each day, maybe an hour or two. I thought I could manage it along with my own work, but after 1 week, I realized that I was working late every night, and even with the extra hours, I was still falling behind on my own tasks. I started feeling frustrated. I felt tired and a little overwhelmed, but at the same time, I felt responsible because I had already said yes. I couldn't just ignore the problem or hope it would fix itself. Instead of staying quiet, I decided to have an honest conversation with my colleague. I explained my situation clearly and calmly. I told them how much I could handle and what I was struggling with. To my surprise, they understood immediately. They thanked me for being honest and open about my situation. We worked together to adjust the plan, we shared the work more evenly, and we managed to finish the project successfully. This experience taught me an important lesson about communication and honesty. Saying yes without thinking can create problems, but being open and talking about challenges can solve them. I also learned that it's okay to ask for help or to share responsibilities. Real-life experiences like this may seem small at first, but they can teach you valuable lessons that you remember for a long time. By listening to real stories like this, you can improve your English naturally. You can learn how people connect ideas, explain feelings, and tell their experiences in a way that sounds real and easy to understand. Simple stories, when told well, can sound very impressive and natural in English. This story may seem simple, but it shows something important: how people explain problems, feelings, and solutions in everyday English. Not every story has to be big or dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes the small and ordinary moments teach us a lot. Now, think about another common situation, an unexpected conversation with a stranger. One evening, I was standing in a long line at a small store. Everyone looked tired and a little impatient. People were checking their phones, sighing, and waiting quietly. The person in front of me suddenly turned around and made a small comment about how slowly the line was moving. I replied with a short, polite sentence, nothing fancy. At first, that was all. It seemed like just a tiny exchange. But slowly, that little interaction turned into a real conversation. We started talking about work, our daily stress, and some small goals we each had. It was simple, ordinary and honest. When the line finally moved, we laughed together and said goodbye. Nothing dramatic happened, but that short exchange changed the mood of the moment. It made the weight lighter, and it reminded me how small talks can connect people. Real-life stories like this often focus on atmosphere, feelings, and small details instead of big events. Real-life stories include ordinary moments, small thoughts, and reflections. They are not always perfect or exciting, but they are real. Here's another example. Last year, I had to make a decision that felt risky. I wanted to change my daily routine, but I was also comfortable where I was. My days were predictable, and that comfort slowly turned into boredom. One afternoon, I noticed how tired I felt, even though it was still early in the day. That moment made me stop and think. I asked myself a simple question: what am I avoiding? I realized that fear of discomfort was holding me back. I did not change everything at once. I made one small change and kept doing it every day. Over time, that small choice improved my confidence and energy. It reminded me that even little steps can make a big difference. When people share stories like this, they often move between what happened in the past and what they understand in the present. This helps listeners connect with the story and learn from it. As you listen to these stories, notice how words that show time help organize the story. Words like one day, at first, after a while, and in the end guide the listener naturally. Advanced English is not always about using hard words. It's more about clarity, connection, and control. How sentences flow, how ideas are linked, and how emotions are expressed are what make English sound advanced. Real stories sound natural when they include feelings, thoughts, small details, and simple reflections. They do not need fancy vocabulary or dramatic events. Instead, they show honesty, connection, and the small choices that make life meaningful. By practicing these kinds of stories, you can learn to speak English clearly, naturally, and confidently. Real stories feel natural because they follow the way people think and remember experiences. They are not just a list of events. They include thoughts, feelings, and reflections. That is what makes them easy to understand and connect with. Now let's focus on how emotions are described in daily stories. Instead of saying something was simply good or bad, people usually explain how it made them feel. For example, instead of saying, "I was happy," someone might say, "I felt relieved after the conversation." Or instead of saying, "I was angry," they might say, "I felt tense and distracted all day." These small changes make stories feel more real, personal, and relatable. Listeners can imagine the situation and connect with your experience. Another situation many people talk about is learning from failure. I remember one time I prepared carefully for an important discussion. I thought I knew exactly what I would say, and I practiced a lot. But when the moment came, my ideas did not come out the way I planned. I noticed confusion on the other person's face, and my confidence dropped immediately. I felt frustrated and a little embarrassed. Afterward, I replayed the moment in my head many times. I thought about what went wrong and what I could have done differently. Later, I realized that the failure was not because of my ability, but because I had prepared in the wrong direction. That experience taught me a very important lesson: focus more on clarity than perfection. When people share stories like this, they often include reflection. Reflection shows growth and self-awareness, and it helps others understand what was learned from the experience. As we continue, notice how cause and effect are explained in stories. People often use words and phrases like "because of that," or "as a result," or "that is when I realized." These small phrases help connect actions to results and make your English sound thoughtful and mature. Using these connections can turn a simple story into something meaningful that listeners can follow and relate to. Real stories are powerful because they are relatable. They also give you the chance to practice English the way people actually use it in conversations, rather than just using complicated words. let me share another real story that many people quietly relate to but rarely talk about openly. A while ago, I noticed that I was always busy but rarely satisfied at the end of the day. My schedule was full, my tasks were completed, and people around me thought I was doing well. Everything seemed fine from the outside. Still, I felt a constant pressure that never went away. No matter how much I finished, it felt like it was never enough. One evening, after finishing everything on my list, I finally sat down and took a deep breath. I looked around and realized that even though I was busy, I was not paying attention to what truly mattered to me. I was just moving from one task to another, reacting to what needed to be done, and forgetting to think about what made me happy or energized. That quiet moment of reflection helped me understand that it's important to make time for yourself even when life feels busy. Stories like these show how ordinary experiences, emotions, and reflections can be shared in English in a way that feels honest and real. By practicing with real-life examples, you can learn to explain feelings, connect ideas, and reflect on experiences naturally. That is what makes English sound fluent and thoughtful. One evening, after finishing everything on my list, I finally sat down and realized something important. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly present. I had been so busy doing tasks that I had forgotten to stop and pay attention to the moment. That moment of realization was a little uncomfortable, but it was honest. When people tell stories like this in real life, they often focus on the realization rather than immediate action. Awareness usually comes before change. In daily conversations, people explain how they reached a realization using phrases like, "I suddenly noticed," "it hit me that," or "that was the moment I understood." These expressions are very common in natural English. They show a shift in thinking or understanding, which helps listeners follow your story clearly. In my case, this realization did not come from a big event or a sudden problem. It came from a quiet moment, silence, and reflection. After that, I decided to change how I measured a good day. Instead of focusing only on completing tasks, I started paying attention to how I felt during the day. Over time, this small change improved both my work and my mood. I felt more relaxed, more present, and more satisfied. This is how people often describe personal growth in real life, step by step, honestly, and without dramatic language. Now let me share another story about miscommunication, which is one of the most common topics in everyday English. One time, I sent a short message to someone thinking it was clear and polite. Later, I received a reply that felt distant and cold. At first, I felt confused and slightly annoyed. I read my original message again and realized that it sounded too brief and direct. My intention had been efficiency, but it came across as impatient. Instead of ignoring the issue, I sent a follow-up message. In the new message, I explained my tone and intention clearly. Almost immediately, the tension disappeared and the conversation felt smooth again. Stories like this often explain not only what happened, but also how tone, intention, and perception can affect communication. People usually reflect and correct their actions, saying things like, "I did not mean it that way," or "I realized how it sounded." These phrases are extremely useful for learners because they teach how to repair conversations politely and naturally. Real English is not perfect English. It is flexible, practical, and full of small choices that make communication effective. People do not always speak in complete sentences or use complicated vocabulary. Instead, they focus on clarity, honesty, and connection. Using simple words carefully, showing feelings, and explaining intentions can make your English sound natural and confident. By practicing stories like these, you can learn to explain your experiences, emotions, and realizations in ways that are easy to understand. You also learn how to link ideas, describe cause and effect, and share personal growth, all in a style that is close to how people actually speak. Real stories help you practice English the way it is really used in daily life, honest, flexible, and relatable. Real English adapts to situations. It is flexible, practical, and focused on clarity rather than perfection. Let me share another real story, this time about expectations and disappointment. A friend once recommended a book to me and described it as life-changing. Naturally, I started reading it with very high expectations. I imagined that it would completely change how I thought and felt, but after finishing it, I felt underwhelmed. The book was good, but it did not match the image I had built in my mind. Later, I realized that my disappointment did not come from the book itself. It came from my expectations. I had built an idea in my head that was impossible to meet. When I shared this story with others, I did not criticize the book. Instead, I explained how expectations can shape our reactions. In everyday conversations, people often soften their opinions to sound balanced and respectful. They might say things like, "I expected more," or "It was not exactly what I imagined," or "It didn't quite meet my expectations." These small phrases help you express disappointment without sounding harsh. They are a subtle but important skill in advanced daily English. Now, let me tell a story about responsibility and boundaries. There was a time when I said yes to almost every request. I believed that being helpful meant being available all the time. At first, it felt good to help, but slowly this habit led to exhaustion. I started feeling tired, stressed, and even anxious whenever I saw a new message or request. One weekend, I noticed that I was dreading simple messages because I knew they would turn into obligations. That feeling was a warning sign. I decided to set clear boundaries and communicate them politely. I told people when I was available and when I needed time for myself. To my surprise, the result was not conflict as I had feared. Instead, people respected my decisions. When people tell stories about boundaries, they often focus on emotional shift more than external reactions. In natural English, these shifts are described calmly and reflectively. People use phrases like, "I started to notice," "I made a decision," or "over time, things improved." These phrases signal maturity and self-awareness. Now, let's think about how people talk about uncertainty. Here is a story that shows this clearly. I once faced a decision where there was no obvious correct answer. Both options had advantages and risks. I was unsure what to do, and I felt nervous about making the wrong choice. Instead of rushing, I took time to consider my feelings and priorities. I thought about what I wanted to achieve, how each option might affect me, and what risks I was willing to take. In the end, I made a choice that felt right in that moment, even though it was not perfect. Stories about uncertainty often include reflection, thought process, and feelings of doubt. People explain how they thought through situations and what influenced their decisions. Using simple, clear language to describe uncertainty makes your English sound natural and relatable. Phrases like, "I was not sure," "I thought about it carefully," or "in the end, I decided," are very common in real conversations. Real-life stories often include expectations, boundaries, and uncertainty. They focus on emotions, reflections, and small choices, rather than dramatic events. By practicing stories like these, you can learn to speak English naturally, express feelings, connect ideas, and show personal growth in a way that is easy to understand and relatable. I spent several days thinking about that decision. I wrote down the advantages and disadvantages, talked to people I trusted, and tried to imagine different outcomes. In the end, I chose the option that felt more aligned with my values, even though it felt less certain and more risky. Later, when people ask me about my choice, I focus more on my reasoning than on the final result. In daily English, people often explain their thought process when the outcome is still unknown. They use expressions like, "I was unsure," "I weighed my options," or "I trusted my judgment." These phrases show depth and complexity without using difficult vocabulary. Another common everyday story involves noticing changes in relationships. Over time, some relationships become quieter. not because of conflict, but because life becomes busy. I once realized that I had not had a deep conversation with someone I cared about in a long time. Our conversations had slowly become short and practical. We talked about schedules and responsibilities, but not about feelings or thoughts. Instead of blaming time or distance, I decided to reach out and suggest a real conversation. That small effort reopened a meaningful connection. When people share stories like this, they often focus on intention and effort rather than blame. In advanced daily English, emotional distance is usually described gently. People say things like, "we drifted apart," "we lost touch," or "things became more surface level." These expressions are subtle but powerful, and they help keep the story calm and respectful. Now let's talk about learning moments. One time, I tried something new and failed in front of other people. In that moment, the embarrassment felt intense. I wanted the moment to end quickly. Later, when I talked about the experience, I noticed something interesting. People laughed, shared similar stories, and related to how I felt. Over time, the failure became less about shame and more about shared experience. This is how real stories often change with time. The emotional weight becomes lighter and the lesson becomes clearer. People often introduce these stories with phrases like, "at the time it felt terrible," or "looking back, I can see." This structure is very common in natural storytelling because it shows growth and perspective. Another real-life situation many people talk about is patience. I once worked toward a goal that took much longer than I expected. At first, I was motivated and excited. After some time, progress felt slow and I became discouraged. I questioned whether the effort was worth it. Instead of focusing on the final result, I learned to focus on consistency. I showed up even on days when motivation was low. When I describe this story now, I talk about persistence rather than success. In everyday English, people often value effort just as much as outcomes. They use phrases like, "I kept going," "I stayed consistent," or "I learned to be patient." These expressions sound calm and confident. They are not dramatic, but they feel real and mature. Now, think about how people talk about unexpected kindness. One day, during a stressful moment, someone offered help without being asked. The action itself was small, but the timing made it powerful. When I tell the story, I focus more on how it made me feel than on what exactly happened. In daily English, people often say things like, "it meant more than they realized," or "it made a difference at that moment." These expressions clearly show emotional impact without needing many details. Let's look at another common story involving self-doubt. There was a time when I questioned whether I was capable of handling a responsibility I had already accepted. This doubt did not come from failure, it came from comparison. I noticed how easily other people seemed to manage similar situations, and I began to doubt myself. Over time, I realized something important. Confidence often hides effort. What looks easy from the outside often requires unseen work and struggle. When I share this story, I focus on my internal struggle rather than external appearance. In reflective conversations, people often use phrases like, "I started to question myself," "I compared myself to others," or "I had to remind myself." These expressions are very common in natural English and help listeners understand thoughts and emotions clearly. Daily use real stories often end with insight rather than a clear conclusion. Even when a situation is resolved, people focus on what they learned instead of claiming success or failure. That is why these stories feel ongoing and human. They reflect real thinking, not perfect storytelling. As you continue listening, pay attention to how these stories are built. They usually start with context, move through experience, include emotion, and end with reflection. This structure appears again and again in real conversations. When you practice telling your own stories in this way, your English starts to sound more natural, confident, and advanced. Let's keep moving forward with more daily use real stories that reflect how people actually think, speak, and explain their experiences. These stories are not meant to impress anyone. They are meant to communicate truth, emotion, and understanding. This is often how advanced English sounds in real life: simple, honest, and thoughtful. I want to share a moment when listening mattered more than speaking. A while ago, someone close to me was clearly under stress, but they were not talking much about it. I could feel that something was wrong, even though they were trying to act normal. In the past, I might have offered advice too quickly or tried to fix the situation. This time, I chose a different approach. I asked one simple question and then stayed quiet. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable. I wondered if I should say more, but after a moment, they began to speak slowly and honestly. They shared thoughts and feelings they had been holding inside. In that moment, I realized something important. My role was not to fix the problem or give solutions. My role was simply to be present and listen. When people describe moments like this, they often focus on restraint and awareness. They use phrases like, "I held back," "I let them speak," or "I realized listening was enough." These expressions show emotional maturity and control. They also reflect a deeper understanding of communication, where silence can sometimes be more powerful than words. Here's another situation that many people experience, but explained differently as they grow older. There was a time when I believed that being busy meant being important. I filled every day with activity and avoided empty time. I thought constant movement meant progress. Over the years, I began to notice something unexpected. Constant activity made my thinking shallow. I was reacting to situations instead of reflecting on them. One day, I intentionally left space in my schedule. I did not plan anything for that time. At first, it felt strange and unproductive. I felt slightly uncomfortable, as if I was wasting time. Later, it felt necessary. The quiet gave me space to think, reflect, and understand myself better. When people talk about this kind of shift, they often say things like, "I learned to slow down," or "I stopped filling every moment." These phrases show a change in values rather than just a change in habits. They reflect maturity and self-awareness, not laziness or lack of ambition. Real-life stories like these help explain growth in a natural way. They do not rely on dramatic language or big events. Instead, they show how small realizations, quiet moments, and simple choices slowly change how people think and live. This is why daily use stories are so powerful for learning English. They sound real because they come from real thinking, real emotion, and real experience. Let me share a moment when listening mattered more than speaking. A while ago, someone close to me was clearly under stress, but they were not talking much about it. I could feel that something was wrong, even though they were trying to act normal. In the past, I might have offered advice too quickly or tried to fix the situation. This time, I chose a different approach. I asked one simple question and then stayed quiet. These expressions show openness without weakness and confidence without aggression. Another real-life story involves waiting for something important. There was a time when I was expecting an outcome that I had no control over. I checked my messages frequently and replayed possible scenarios in my head. Though waiting slowly became more exhausting than the result itself, I felt restless, distracted, and tense. Eventually, I accepted that uncertainty was part of the process. I reminded myself that worrying would not change the outcome. When the result finally arrived, it mattered less than I had expected. What stayed with me was how much energy I had spent worrying. When people talk about waiting, they often describe emotional cycles. They say things like, "I kept checking," "I tried to distract myself," or "I learned to let go." These phrases sound natural and honest because they reflect real emotional experience. Now, let's shift to a story about habits. There was a time when I tried to change several habits at once. I wanted fast results and clear improvement. I believed that more effort would lead to quicker success. Instead, I felt overwhelmed and inconsistent. I started strong but lost focus quickly. After failing more than once, I decided to simplify my approach. I focused on one small habit and protected it carefully. I did not try to be perfect, I just tried to be consistent. Over time, that single habit began to influence other areas of my life naturally. When people explain habit change in daily English, they often say things like, I started small, or I focused on one thing. These expressions show realism, patience, and self-awareness. Another common daily use story involves a change in priorities. At one stage of my life, success meant external approval. I cared a lot about how others saw me and what they thought. Later, success began to mean something different. It meant internal peace and balance. This change did not happen suddenly. It happened through repeated moments of exhaustion and reflection. I slowly realized that constant pressure was not sustainable. When people describe changing priorities, they often say things like, my definition changed, or I started valuing different things. These expressions sound thoughtful and mature. They show growth without drama. Now, let's talk about learning through observation. I once noticed how someone handled pressure calmly while others reacted emotionally. They spoke slowly, listened carefully, and did not rush to respond. Watching them made me reflect on my own reactions. I realized that calmness is often a choice, not a personality trait. When people share stories like these, they often explain what they noticed and how it influenced them. Daily use real stories like these focus on awareness, emotion, and reflection. They show how people learn, change, and grow over time. This is why they sound natural and relatable. I remember walking into a room where everyone seemed more confident and experienced than I felt. My first instinct was to stay quiet and invisible. I did not want to say the wrong thing or draw attention to myself. After a few minutes, I paused and reminded myself of something important. Presence matters more than perfection. I decided to speak once, clearly and calmly. That small action changed how I felt for the rest of the interaction. I felt more grounded and more included. When people share stories like this, they often focus on internal dialogue. They use phrases like, I told myself, or I reminded myself. These expressions help explain internal decisions in a natural and honest way. They show what was happening inside, not just what happened on the outside. Now, let's talk about regret. There was a time when I missed an opportunity because I waited too long to decide. At the time, I told myself that waiting was being careful and responsible. Later, I realized that it was fear. When I talk about the story now, I do not focus on blaming myself. I focus on understanding what stopped me. People often say things like, I wish I had acted sooner, or I learned from that delay. These expressions allow reflection without negativity. They show growth instead of regret. Here's a story about honesty. There was a moment when telling the truth felt risky. Avoiding the truth would have been easier in the short term. I knew honesty might create discomfort, but I chose it anyway. I prepared myself for an uncomfortable conversation. The discussion was difficult, but it brought clarity. The tension I feared did not last as long as I expected. When people talk about honesty in real life, they often say things like, it was uncomfortable but necessary, or it cleared the air. These phrases show balance and emotional awareness. Another common daily use story involves a change in priorities. At one stage of my life, success meant external approval. I cared a lot about how others saw me and what they thought. Later, success began to mean something different. It meant internal peace and balance. This change did not happen suddenly. It happened through repeated moments of exhaustion and reflection. I slowly realized that constant pressure was not sustainable. When people describe changing priorities, they often say things like, "My definition changed," or "I started valuing different things." These expressions sound thoughtful and mature. They show growth without drama. Now, let's talk about learning through observation. I once noticed how someone handled pressure calmly while others reacted emotionally. They spoke slowly, listened carefully, and did not rush to respond. Watching them made me reflect on my own reactions. I realized that calmness is often a choice, not a personality trait. When people share stories like these, they often explain what they noticed and how it influenced them. Daily use real stories like these focus on awareness, emotion, and reflection. They show how people learn, change, and grow over time. This is why they sound natural and relatable. They are not perfect stories. They are honest ones. And that honesty is what makes English sound truly advanced in real life. Instead of asking them directly how they stayed calm, I chose to observe their behavior over time. I watched how they paused before responding, how they spoke slowly, and how they chose their words carefully. I noticed that they did not rush or react emotionally. When I describe the story, I focus on noticing rather than copying. In everyday English, people often say things like, "I picked up on," or "I noticed how." These expressions show learning through observation, not instruction, and they sound natural and thoughtful. Another common real-life story involves disappointment that slowly turns into clarity. There was a time when I invested a lot of energy into something that did not work out. At first, I felt frustrated and disappointed. I felt like my time and effort had been wasted. Later, after some distance, I realized that the experience helped clarify what I truly wanted. When people explain this kind of shift, they often say things like, "It showed me what mattered," or "It helped me understand myself better." These expressions allow positive framing without ignoring the difficulty of the experience. Now, think about how people talk about routine without actually calling it routine. I once realized that my days looked almost the same, but my attitude decided how those days felt. The tasks did not change, but my mindset did. When I adjusted how I thought about my day, the same activities felt lighter and more manageable. When people share this insight, they often say, "Nothing really changed except my perspective." This phrase appears often in reflective conversations because it shows inner change rather than external change. Another real-life story involves asking for help. There was a time when I believed that asking for help meant weakness. I tried to handle everything on my own and carried unnecessary pressure. Over time, this became exhausting and ineffective. Eventually, I reached a point where continuing alone was no longer helping me move forward. I decided to ask for help clearly and directly. The response I received was supportive, not judgmental. When people talk about this experience, they often say, "I should have asked sooner." This expression appears frequently in honest storytelling because it reflects learning and humility. It shows that strength sometimes comes from asking, not from carrying everything alone. Let's continue with a story about letting go. I once held tightly to an idea because it had worked well in the past. Even when circumstances changed, my attachment stayed the same. I kept forcing the same approach, hoping it would work again. When I finally accepted that things had changed and let go of that idea, progress became easier. When people talk about letting go, they often say things like, "I realized it was time," or "I stopped forcing it." These phrases sound calm and reflective. Stories like these show how people grow through awareness rather than dramatic action. They focus on observation, realization, and small internal shifts. This is how real-life English sounds. It is simple, honest, and deeply human. These phrases show acceptance and an understanding of timing. Another everyday situation many people talk about is appreciation. I once received feedback that was not dramatic or detailed. It was simple, honest, and sincere. At the time, I did not think much about it. I accepted it politely and moved on. Later, I realized how much those few words had influenced my confidence. They stayed in my mind longer than I expected. When people share stories about appreciation, they often say things like, "It stuck with me," or "It stayed with me." These expressions show how small moments can have a lasting impact. Now, let's reflect on how people talk about balance. There was a time when I focused too much on one area of my life and ignored others. At first, everything seemed fine, but slowly the imbalance showed itself through stress, tiredness, and dissatisfaction. Restoring balance did not require a dramatic change. It required conscious adjustment. I had to notice what was missing and make small changes over time. When people explain balance in daily English, they often say things like, "I had to adjust," or "I found a better rhythm." These phrases sound practical and realistic. Another real-life story involves saying no. There was a moment when I declined an opportunity that looked very good on the surface. Many people expected me to accept it, and my decision surprised both them and me. I explained my reasoning calmly and without apology. Afterwards, I felt a sense of relief that confirmed my choice. When people talk about saying no, they often say things like, "It felt right," or "I trusted my decision." These expressions show confidence without arrogance and clarity without defensiveness. Daily use real stories often include small turning points instead of dramatic endings. They reflect how people process life gradually through thought and reflection. As you listen to these stories, notice how the language stays clear, connected, and intentional. Advanced English is not about complexity. It is about precision, honesty, and meaning. I remember a period in my life when I felt constantly distracted. I was physically present, but my attention was always somewhere else. Conversations felt rushed, and my responses felt automatic. I listened, but I wasn't fully engaged. One day, someone gently pointed out that I seemed distant, even when I was listening. At first, I felt defensive. I wanted to explain myself and deny it. Later, after thinking about it, I realized they were right. I had been dividing my attention without noticing. That realization made me slow down and become more aware of how I showed up in conversations. I started putting my phone away, pausing before responding, and giving people my full attention. When people share stories like this, they often focus on awareness rather than blame. They explain what they noticed and how it changed their behavior. These stories feel real because they reflect everyday thinking, not perfect behavior. They remind us that growth often begins with noticing, not fixing. Real-life English stories sound natural because they follow this pattern. They move from experience to realization and then to small change. This is how people explain their lives honestly and clearly in everyday conversation. When people tell stories like this, they often describe an uncomfortable truth that leads to growth. They use phrases such as, "I didn't notice it at first," or "I didn't want to admit it." These expressions show honesty and vulnerability. They help the listener understand that growth often begins with discomfort, not confidence. Another real-life story involves adjusting expectations of yourself. There was a time when I believed I had to perform at my best every single day. If my energy dropped or my focus wasn't perfect, I felt like I had failed. At first, this mindset felt motivating. Over time, it became exhausting. I noticed that my creativity disappeared and my patience became shorter. I was doing more but enjoying less. Eventually, I realized that consistency matters more than intensity. Showing up regularly was more important than pushing myself too hard. When people explain this realization, they often say things like, "I stopped being so hard on myself," or "I learned to allow off days." These expressions sound gentle and realistic. They reflect maturity and self-respect rather than laziness. Now, let's talk about learning something later than expected. I once discovered a skill that I wished I had learned much earlier in life. At first, regret was my strongest reaction. I kept thinking about lost time and missed opportunities. Slowly, curiosity replaced regret. I decided to focus on learning instead of timing. When people share stories like this, they often say, "Better late than never," or "I focused on where I was, not where I should have been." These phrases are very common in reflective, everyday English and help turn regret into motivation. Another situation many people describe is feeling misunderstood. I once explained my intentions clearly, at least from my point of view, but the message was received very differently. Instead of creating clarity, the conversation created distance. I felt frustrated at first. Instead of repeating myself more loudly or firmly, I chose a different approach. I tried to look at the situation from the other person's side. I thought about how my words and actions might have appeared to them. When people talk about resolving misunderstandings, they often say, "I tried to see it from their perspective." This phrase shows emotional intelligence and effort. It signals that understanding is more important than being right. Let's move to a story about patience with progress. There was a goal I worked towards steadily for a long time without seeing clear results. On the surface, nothing seemed to be changing. Quietly, doubt began to grow. I questioned whether my effort was worth it and whether I was moving in the right direction. Instead of giving up, I reminded myself that progress is not always visible. Some changes happen slowly beneath the surface. Over time, small improvements appeared and my confidence returned. When people describe this kind of experience, they often focus on endurance rather than achievement. They talk about staying committed even when motivation fades. Stories like these reflect real thinking and real emotion. They do not rush to conclusions or dramatic endings. They show learning as a gradual process. This is why daily use real stories feel natural and human. They explain life the way people actually experience it, through reflection, adjustment, and quiet growth. For a long time, I questioned whether my effort was meaningful. I showed up, stayed consistent, and kept going, but nothing obvious seemed to change. Then, one day, a small sign of progress appeared. It was not dramatic or exciting, but it was real. That moment reminded me that progress often happens quietly, without attention or celebration. When people tell stories like this, they often say things like, "It did not happen overnight," or "Progress was slow but steady." These expressions sound calm, grounded, and honest. Now, let's talk about moments of acceptance. There was a time when I stopped resisting a situation I could not change. I realized that fighting reality was draining my energy. When I accepted the situation fully, something shifted. I felt lighter and more focused. When people describe this experience, they often say, "I accepted it fully." This simple phrase shows resolution and peace without needing extra explanation. Another real-life story involves noticing when effort slowly turns into a habit. I once worked very hard to build a routine. At first, it required discipline and attention every day. Over time, that effort became natural. I no longer had to force it. When people describe this transition, they often say it became part of my life. This phrase reflects integration and stability, not struggle. Now, think about how people talk about growth without announcing it. I once realized that I no longer felt the need to talk about my progress.
I did not need to explain it or prove it. The changes showed quietly through my behavior, my choices, and my reactions. When people share this understanding, they often say, "Growth became quiet." This phrase suggests maturity and confidence without ego. Daily use real stories often continue without a clear ending because growth does not stop. Life does not pause to create perfect conclusions. Instead, these stories move forward through reflection, awareness, and choice. As you listen, notice how the language stays clear, complete, and intentional. That's what makes it sound natural and advanced. This is how English sounds in real life when people speak honestly about who they are becoming and what they are learning along the way. As we come to the close of today's episode, take a moment to think about your own daily experiences. The stories we explored today were not extraordinary. There were no dramatic events or perfect endings, but they were real, and that's exactly why they matter. Real English lives inside small moments, quiet decisions, honest reflections, and gradual change. You don't need perfect words or dramatic events to speak advanced English. You only need clarity, awareness, and the courage to express what you truly experience. When you practice telling your own real stories, focus on what you noticed, how you felt, and what you learned. Use complete thoughts. Take your time. Let your ideas connect naturally instead of rushing. This is how your English becomes confident and natural, not by memorizing complex vocabulary, but by using simple language with intention. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'm Blake, and this has been the English Talk Podcast. Keep listening to real stories, keep reflecting on your own experiences, and keep using English as a tool to express who you are and how you see the world. Let me share another daily youth story, this time about change that others notice before you do. Once, someone told me that I seemed more confident than before. At first, I didn't believe them.
Inside, I still felt uncertain and unsure of myself. Over time, I realized something important. Confidence often appears on the outside before it feels real on the inside. When people describe this experience, they often say, "I didn't feel it yet, but others could see it." This shows how internal and external experiences can be very different. Now let's look at boundaries again, but from a different angle. I once set a boundary that felt reasonable and necessary to me, but it surprised other people. Their first reaction wasn't anger or disagreement, it was silence. That silence made me uncomfortable. I wondered if I had done something wrong or explained myself poorly. Later, I understood that adjustment takes time. When people talk about boundaries, they often say things like, "It felt awkward at first," or "People needed time to adjust." These phrases help normalize discomfort and remind us that change doesn't always bring immediate clarity. Another real-life situation involves accepting help without guilt. There was a time when I received support during a difficult period, and instead of feeling grateful, I felt uncomfortable. I worried about being a burden. I felt like I should handle everything on my own. Eventually, I realized that support is not a transaction, it is part of human connection. When people describe this shift in thinking, they often say, "I learned to accept help," or "I stopped feeling guilty for needing support." These expressions show emotional growth and self-compassion. Daily use real stories like these reflect how people actually think and change. They are not loud or dramatic. They are quiet, honest, and thoughtful. They show learning through reflection, not perfection. When you practice sharing your own experiences this way, your English becomes natural, confident, and meaningful. Real fluency does not come from sounding impressive, it comes from sounding real. And real English weaves in awareness, emotion, and simple truth. Learning to accept help and stop feeling guilty is a sign of emotional growth. Once I realized that support is not a burden, I could rely on others without shame. These moments are small but meaningful because they show self-awareness and understanding. Let's talk about moments of clarity that come from repetition. I once heard the same advice from different people over time. Each time I nodded and dismissed it politely, thinking I already knew enough. Then one day, the advice finally made sense. The advice had not changed, but I had. My readiness to hear it had grown. When people share stories like this, they often say, "I was not ready to hear it before." This is a common phrase in reflective storytelling, and it shows how timing affects understanding. Another story involves stepping back instead of stepping forward. There was a situation where my first instinct was to act quickly. I wanted to solve it immediately, but I paused. That pause stopped tension from growing and prevented unnecessary conflict. When people describe moments like this, they often say, "I decided to wait," or "I chose not to react immediately." These expressions highlight patience and self-control without making the story dramatic. Now, let's explore improvement that feels invisible. I once practiced something regularly but didn't notice any progress. Frustration quietly built up, and I wondered if my effort was wasted. Then one day, I handled a situation naturally that would have been difficult before. That was when I realized improvement had been happening all along, even if I hadn't seen it. When people talk about this, they often say, "I did not notice it until later." This phrase is common in learning stories and reflects real-life growth. Another story involves reevaluating success. I once reached a goal I had worked toward for a long time. I expected a big feeling of satisfaction, but it was brief and almost surprising. That experience taught me that meaning comes from the process, not just the achievement. When people explain this realization, they often say the journey mattered more than the result. This phrase is widely used because it reflects lived experience and honest understanding. Let's talk about trust. I once put my trust in someone without fully understanding the situation. The outcome was not what I hoped for. At first, I could have become guarded or distant, but I didn't. Instead, I became more thoughtful and careful, learning how to balance openness with discernment. Stories like this often focus not on failure, but on the lessons learned and the way we respond. Daily use real stories like these are simple, quiet, and reflective. They are not about dramatic events or perfect endings. They are about noticing small changes, learning slowly, and understanding yourself and others better. When you practice telling your own stories in this way, your English becomes natural, confident, and meaningful. Real English is not about sounding impressive. It is about speaking honestly about what you notice, feel, and learn. It comes from reflection, awareness, and intention. And that is how small moments, repeated lessons, pauses, and quiet improvements turn into real language that connects with people. Lessons about trust often focus on balance rather than complete caution. I once put my trust in someone without fully understanding the situation. The outcome was not what I hoped for. At first, I could have become guarded or distant, but I didn't. Instead, I became more thoughtful and careful, learning how to balance openness with discernment. Stories like this often focus not on failure, but on the lessons learned and the way we respond. Daily use real stories like these are simple, quiet, and reflective. They are not about dramatic events or perfect endings. They are about noticing small changes, learning slowly, and understanding yourself and others better. When you practice telling your own stories in this way, resilience is also built quietly over time. There was a period when things did not go as planned repeatedly. Small disappointments built up, and discouragement grew slowly. Instead of giving up, I adjusted my approach and kept going. When people explain this type of experience, they often focus on persistence rather than immediate results. They might say, "I kept trying," or "I adjusted and continued." These phrases show patience, determination, and calm confidence. These everyday stories are simple, reflective, and honest. They show growth, awareness, and learning in real life, not dramatic endings or perfect solutions. By sharing small moments like these, your English becomes natural and relatable. It is about describing what you notice, how you feel, and what you learn rather than trying to impress anyone. Real fluency comes from observing, reflecting, and expressing experiences clearly. Simple phrases like, "I stopped over-explaining, it got easier over time," or "I started to notice a pattern," may seem small, but they carry real meaning. They help you sound confident and aware. These stories are not just about actions, they are about thought, feeling, and understanding. When you practice telling your own stories in this way, your English becomes more natural, intentional, and connected to the real world. You do not need dramatic events or fancy words, just honesty, reflection, and simple language that communicates clearly. These small, quiet lessons form the heart of real-life English. When people talk about resilience, they often describe adapting rather than giving up. I remember a time when things did not go as I expected. I could have quit, but instead I chose to adjust my approach. Over time, I realized that small changes and persistence mattered more than dramatic results. When people share stories like this, they often say, "I adapted rather than quit." This simple phrase shows strength, calmness, and control without exaggeration. Gratitude is another lesson that often comes slowly. I once took something stable and reliable in my life for granted. It was always there, so I didn't notice it. Then, when it changed, I realized how important it had been. People often describe experiences like this by saying, "I didn't realize its importance until it was gone." This simple expression captures the quiet human realization that we often notice value only after it changes. Calm decision-making is another everyday situation. I remember facing pressure to make a choice quickly. At first, I felt stressed and unsure. Then I asked for more time. That short pause made a big difference in the outcome. When people talk about experiences like this, they often say, "Taking time helped." This phrase reflects patience, thoughtfulness, and steady judgment. Confidence is also something people often rethink. I used to believe that confidence meant being certain all the time. Later, I realized that real confidence can exist even when we feel doubt. It means being okay with not knowing everything and moving forward anyway. People describe this kind of learning with phrases like, "I became comfortable with not knowing everything." These words show maturity and reflection. Many real-life stories do not follow a straight line. People revisit the same idea, notice patterns, and slowly refine their understanding. As you listen, notice how the language stays simple, clear, and intentional. This is what advanced English sounds like in real life. It is reflective, thoughtful, and grounded in experience. Sometimes our own reactions teach us important lessons. I remember a time when I noticed that I reacted faster than I understood a situation. When something unexpected happened, I responded immediately without thinking. One day, after reacting in a way I later regretted, I paused and asked myself why I felt the need to respond so quickly. That question stayed with me. Over time, I learned to create a small gap between what happens and how I respond. People often describe this kind of learning with phrases like, "I learned to pause," or "I stopped reacting automatically." These simple expressions capture awareness, control, and thoughtful decision-making. Patience, observation, and reflection appear again and again in daily stories. People describe small shifts in perspective or behavior that change their lives quietly but meaningfully.
Instead of focusing on dramatic events, they focus on noticing patterns, adjusting reactions, and valuing experiences in a deliberate way. Simple language can show growth, insight, and emotional awareness. The common thread in these stories is that learning and improvement often happen quietly. Confidence, patience, awareness, and understanding grow slowly over time through small choices and reflection. Advanced English does not need complicated vocabulary. It thrives on clarity, connection, and honesty. When you tell your own stories, focus on what you notice